to bring education and functional medicine into providers' daily life and what happens every day when you go to work, that you get to participate in this and essentially build a cathedral of health for people. I want to thank our sponsors and partners and donors because people have, we're a fledgling foundation, so we didn't start with any money. So to put on an event like this was really a privilege. So Genova Diagnostics, Orthomolecular, and our sponsors, Johnson Foundation, are all here tonight, and Ortho and Genova will be saying a few words. It was supposed to be Eddie from Genova, but his wife is actually in labor, so he begged out. And so they'll be speaking for a few moments, and then I'll come back to introduce our speaker tonight. Alexis, you're up.
Hi everybody, I'm Alexis Brown with Genova Diagnostics. As Wendy said, Eddie is, most of you work with Eddie, he's not here because his wife is in labor. That's supposedly, yeah, no baby yet. But for those of you who aren't familiar with Genova, we are a specialty clinical laboratory based out of Asheville, North Carolina. And we have many different testing product lines, from immunology to endocrinology. We have a lot of information outside relating more so to what Amy's going to be speaking about. So if you guys have any questions after, please feel free to come see me. And if you wouldn't mind signing your name in on the table, we greatly appreciate that.
And I'm Brendan from Orthomolecular. We've got there a lot of familiar faces, so welcome. And to those of you who don't know me, we are a professional nutraceutical manufacturer. I have the distinct pleasure of working with a lot of the practitioners in here. But yeah, we actually specialize in the realms of GI, cardiometabolic, animals, and specifically attributable to tonight, looking at things like methylation. But more on to what we're here for. So when we all got together 6-7 months ago, we started talking about this. We wanted to create a group that had two very distinct goals. One thing that's been extremely consistent with all my visits to most of your offices is, hey, we're out here, we're practicing functional medicine, but it seems like there's no real network, there's no real, alliance amongst like-minded thinkers like yourselves. So what we wanted to create was just that. Everyone sees each other at all these IFM, A4M conferences, but we wanted to create a more consistent way of relying on your peers. So essentially, if you're a PCP and you're looking for an integrative endocrinologist or you're looking for an integrative GI doc, by creating this team of like-minded practitioners, we're going to be able to do just that. So I encourage all of you, obviously Dr. Yasko will be speaking here in a few minutes, but during the low times, if you see a practitioner out there that you don't know, introduce yourself, talk about your specialties, network with one another, pass contact info, because that, after all, is definitely one of the main reasons we're here. The second aspect is, I don't have to tell anyone in this room, but the realm of functional medicine is always changing. It's something that's always evolving, so the second major objective is, of course, education for yourself. So without further ado. Yeah.
So the first thing Amy said to me was, we got to get this out here so that it's more common in doctors' world. We need to create a community. And I think if I were to pinpoint the one thing that the majority of humans are looking for now, it's connection and community with others. And so I'm extremely grateful that that's where you come from, because that is one of our goals, is to create connection and community within this type of community. So thank you for that, first off. She said to me I should not make a big deal, I should be kind of low-key. You all know me and I'm not low-key. She is low-key, so we sort of have a clash of cultures going on. So what I'll say about you is I met you tonight, and I'm extremely moved at the kind of guts that you have to pick up a family of young children from a new home where the plantings were not watered yet. Thank you, Ed, wherever you are, and move them to Maine from a vision that you had about the type of lifestyle that would work for you and your family, and also that you had created a marriage in which your partner was able to recognize you as a visionary and support you. So that's extremely rare. So thank you for being an amazing leader, both for women and men. And it's really a privilege to have Amy here tonight. She's wicked smart. If you look at her 65,000 Facebook followers, and 15,000 at a time are in the chat rooms. So I don't know anybody who can name tax. And so you've provided a tremendous contribution to medicine, even if you stopped right now. And what you're about to do is create the next generation and pass it on. So thank you. It's my sincere pleasure to welcome you. Thank you. Can everyone hear me or should I use the microphone? If you're okay, yes, no,
I can hear you. We can hear you.
okay. No heckling. Okay, fair enough. Thank you so much for the honor and privilege of being asked to come here and speak to all of you tonight. I really appreciate it. And my goal, as Wendy mentioned, is to get the message of nutrigenomics and methylation out there. As she also mentioned to you, right now we have 65,000 people following the program on Facebook, 15,000 active members on the chat group, and I'm only one person. And so the next phase that needs to happen is for more and more physicians to understand the importance of methylation and nutrigenomics, that it plays a role regardless of what your patient population is. No matter what your practice is focusing on, this is something you need to be thinking about and incorporating into your practice. And my goal is for more and more of you to be available to help those using the program be able to implement the program. The way the program is designed is I essentially put all of the information online for free. I put all the tools out there for someone to be able to utilize this program. And I expect that each of them are going to be working with their own doctor to implement the program. I'll help if someone needs feedback on the test for guidance. But ultimately, the goal is to have more and more physicians in their private practice implementing these concepts and using testing for feedback. And that ties together with what Alexis was talking about with Genova. Whether it's a Genova test, whether it's a DDI test, whether it's a test from one of the neuroscience labs or one of the other labs, the program is very data intensive because I come from a research background. The idea is to run nutrigenomic testing so you have a sense of the imbalances in these pathways, and then use follow-up biochemical testing to be sure that what you're doing nutritionally is making a positive impact. And so the approach that I take is molecular nutrition. But this approach is also being utilized by molecular medicine. The idea is that the more that we know in terms of the genes of the body and how they react, the better we can customize whether it's prescription medication or whether it's nutritional supplementation for ideal health. And there will be a number of slides like this that I'm going to look through very quickly to get through all of the material. It's really my inconsistencies, not even a personal view of nutrigenomics and methylation. But the reason that I put a number of slides on here with references is so that we do have information of peer-reviewed third-party literature that supports a lot of what I'm saying. And in the folders that you have handouts also for all of the PowerPoints, as well as additional information if you want more detailed information than I'll be going over today. And so you don't have to worry about catching every single thing I say, especially as I race through some of the references. There are 4 basic steps that move us from what goes on with our genes to how we implement it. The first is defining the elements that are out of balance, and that's part of what we do with nutrigenomic testing, determining which genes are altered or out of balance, and then looking at ways to improve what's going on. And in this case, we look at specific supplementation to bypass mutations. And while it's been suggested that it could be another 10 to 15 years before standard allopathic medicine will get there, at this point, nutritional support are able to look at and modify molecular pathways in the body. And so if we look at someone such as Bruce Ames, he talks about the fact that we can treat people
by looking at what's going on genetically, not just looking at the way in which they present. And so nutritional interventions make a difference to be able to affect cofactor binding sites and looking at some of these SNPs and imbalances that we see in these pathways. Now, the premise behind the program is I put the information out there for free. And I expect that anyone who's looking to work on this program is going to take advantage of that material that I put out there. And so you have discs in your folders that have everything from the simplified protocol, which is basically in this format, to links to, for instance, www.knowyourgenetics.com will take information from any genetic test you run. So whether it's the test I designed, whether you've run 23andMe, whether you have more limited blood data from one of the genomic tests, you can input that information into the knowyourgenetics.com site for free, and it will give you suggestions based on this protocol related to nutrigenomics. So the program assumes that everyone working on it has a doctor they're working with. And that's the main reason I came here today, was to try to get more of you interested, to be able to be doctors at all of these. Well, no. I'll try to tell that. Resources that some of these 65,000 people can turn to help them to implement the program. When we talk about the program and how successful it is, I don't talk about recovery. I talk about forward progress, because this is a change in a lifestyle. It's not as if you have a bacterial infection that you take an antibiotic for and then you have eradicated that infection. You're looking at a change that affects the rest of your life, because your genetics today that you run on a newborn today, those are the same genes. Great, thank you. Those are the same genes that that individual will contend with for the rest of their life. And so whether those genes predispose to autism, or chronic fatigue, or fibromyalgia, or Parkinson's, or Lou Gehrig's, or MS, that's information that you want to act on and support to bypass those mutations now and for the future. And so one of the key concepts that I will go back over and over today, because it's the hardest one to get your arms around, the nutritional pathway that we're looking at affects those genes in that pathway, but it also affects the global editing process in your body. So it's not just that if there's something wrong in that pathway that those genes don't function. But what it does is it takes out your global methylation for epigenetics, which is your fallback. That's the way that even if you have mutations in other genes, if methylation is functioning optimally, that can get you around those problems. The reason that this pathway is so critical is it not only affects these genes, but it affects the ability to adequately methylate your DNA. And so when we talk about methylating the DNA, and I'm going to explain what that means in a moment, what happens is there are certain sections of the DNA that if they're methylated or not methylated can turn on and turn off genes. And it's not simply a matter of being methylated or not. You want to be methylated properly in the right areas and not over-methylated or under-methylated in the wrong areas, because that basically spells a recipe for cancer. And so even Time magazine recently talks about how your DNA is not your destiny, that epigenetics allows you to make changes to your genes. And so when we talk about the pathway we're working on, the methylation pathway, that is a key to epigenetics. And so if the mutations in your DNA that are your destiny are in the pathway that enables you to get around those mutations with respect to epigenetics, it's the double whammy. And that's part of why we need to look at supplementation. And it's also part of why you want to look at the entire pathway, not just a single gene, because they all interact with each other. So what is methylation? This is a picture of DNA and a methyltransferase transferring a methyl group to the DNA. A methyl group is just a small molecule, bringing everybody back to biochemistry, where we have the carbon and 3 hydrogens, so it's just a small group. It's not that different in size from a water molecule, so this shouldn't be a scary concept to anyone. And the point is that we move these methyl groups, these small groups around on the DNA to turn on and turn off genes and to silence virus. And this goes on in the body constantly. And so epigenetics is an inherited change in gene expression where we're changing the pattern of these methyl groups on the DNA. And this can be inherited the same way that mutations in genes can be inherited. And so the more well methylated or properly methylated, for instance, a mother is during pregnancy, that can be inherited by the child that she has. And so when we look at what happens, you can look at the DNA and you can look at a methyl group and it interacts with proteins in the body. Okay, why you should be concerned. The interface between what goes on with genetics and epigenetics gives us a way to deal with medicine and biology in a new way. The reason you need to be concerned about this pathway is it affects both your genetics and your epigenetics. There are certain mutation combinations that I do not see, and I believe it's because those mutations are lethal. And so if we look at your genetics or your DNA, and we look at the capacity of information with epigenetics, the vast capacity of being able to increase our genetic traits and information through epigenetics is so much larger than just looking at, let's say, 25,000 genes. Only again, the pathway we're looking at affects both of these. And so your genes, your DNA alone is not your destiny. It gives you a blueprint, though, for the type of nutrition you want to look at to bypass mutations in your genes so that your epigenetics can function properly. When we look at articles like this that say why your genes aren't your destiny and how epigenetics can change things, that assumes that the mutations you're looking at are not in the genes involved in epigenetics, okay? So if where we're having the mutations, which is the pathway that I look at, are in the pathway that helps to generate methyl groups for epigenetics, you have a problem if you're not working to bypass those mutations. And again, these marks of these changes on the DNA are inherited, and they're passed down, and what we'll see later is it's not just the mom's epigenetics, it's the dad, it's the grandfather, it's the grandmother. And so, reference from Genetic Engineering News, a classic study that was done, these are genetically identical mice. The only difference between these two mice are the nutrients that they were fed, and these are nutrients in the pathway that we look at for methylation. And so the difference in terms of obesity and health issues is purely related to the diet between the two. And the one that looks healthy, the smaller one with the brown fur, is able to process folate, so able to function without mutations in the pathway we look at. This animal did not receive the same nutrients, but this would be the net effect of someone who has mutations in this pathway who can't use these nutrients. And that's why you want to look at the forms of folate that can be utilized to bypass mutations. Even the FDA is now recognizing that DNA methylation is critical, whether we're looking at cancer, heart issues, birth defects, aging, diabetes, pancreatic issues. So no matter what area of practice you're in, this is something critical that you need to be thinking and understanding to lay the basis, the groundwork for health for everything else that you do. And so everything reaching from cancer to psychiatry, as well as sensitivity
products that you eat. So a lot of adults with chronic fatigue, a lot of kids with autism are very phenol sensitive. That seems to be directly related to a lack of methyl donors. If we look at the pathway, or talk about the pathway, we're looking at the folate pathway. This pathway and using folate and other B vitamins are unique in terms of the way the body utilizes these nutrients. And part of why it's so unique, and the pathway we'll get to in a few moments, is that this is the pathway that generates the methyl groups that allow us to methylate our DNA for epigenetics. If we look at a key factor in cancer, it's related to epigenetic modifications, and if we look at environmental toxins like nickel, directly tied to epigenetic mechanisms. Just like the mouse study, if we look at genetically identical twins, the reason one has lupus and the other one does not is related to the level of DNA methylation. And so even in genetically identical situations, what spells a history of chronic health issues is lack of methylation in one of two identical twins. Again, methylation and lack of methylation playing a role in human tumors, so any form of cancer, and there'll be a slide reference in a moment that shows you more cancers. When we look at autism, epigenetic influences, methylation profiling, and differences in methylated genes. And on this gel, what you can see is, if you compare controls to those with autism, the level of methylation is different. So again, looking at the critical role of being able to generate these methyl groups and move them around so that they can attach appropriately to your DNA to help prevent a slew of health issues. Deal with a lot of adults with adrenal fatigue, or even healthy adults who overdo with exercise and burn out their adrenals. Again, some of this balance is related to epigenetic mechanisms. Memory formation, whether we're looking at problems in the elderly, let's say with Alzheimer's, or we looked at supporting the methylation pathway with all three of our girls to help them do better on tests in school. 2 out of 3 graduated valedictorian from the public school in town, and 1 graduated second in her class from the private school in town. So I would say that supporting the methylation cycle for memory formation does make a positive difference. When we look at cancer cells, compared to normal cells, there are certain regions of the DNA where you want more methylation and other regions where you do not want to be methylated. When we have cancer cells, what happens is an almost opposite situation. We're undermethylated in certain regions and overmethylated in other regions. There are natural supports that can be used for cancer prevention by looking at the methylation cycle, and we'll talk about those in a few moments. And it's not just about Alzheimer's, but aging properly. This pathway is so critical, it's involved in everything from neural tube defects, the likelihood for miscarriages, Down syndrome, graying of hair, and as well as aging. And so that certain components of this pathway start to deteriorate naturally with age. If we look to support this pathway, we can age more gracefully. And so again, another article showing that lack of methylation plays a role both with aging as well as cancer. So the importance of looking at this pathway. Not just related to cancer, but also infectious diseases, and I'll talk about virus in a moment. But methylation makes a huge difference in terms of your body's ability to deal with mycobacterium as well as helicobacter. And reports suggest that 1/3 of the adult population has issues with helicobacter. I see about 2/3 of the individuals with autism have problems with helicobacter. And so we want to be looking at proper methylation when it comes to infectious diseases also. In addition, hear from a lot of people using the program with multiple chemical sensitivity issues and chronic fatigue. Your susceptibility to environmental toxins is directly related to methylation. Really good review article tying together disease epigenetics and mutations. Lack of methylation also plays a role in terms of making sure the X chromosome is silenced properly when you have 2 copies of genes from both parents, as well as trinucleotide repeat disorders such as Angelman syndrome or even Rett syndrome. Again, trying to prevent some of these issues or address them once they're present. Article that came out just last month that type 2 diabetes seems to be directly tied to lack of methylation. Okay, so again, regardless of your patient population, this is something you ought to be thinking about. Another really good article detailing the role that methylation plays with respect to a slew of human diseases, as well as neuropsychiatric issues. Okay. We see a lot of individuals on the program who have problems with bipolar, schizophrenia, psychosis. Your ability to get rid of toxins in the body, as well as to achieve an optimal copper-zinc ratio. I was talking to someone earlier about the copper-zinc ratio. Methylation plays a role in terms of the metallothionein genes functioning properly. CFTR, not that methylation is going to cure cystic fibrosis, but proper methylation does go a long way towards making a positive difference in individuals who have CFTR mutations. And we don't have time today to get into it, but one of the talks that might be on the discs, do we have that one? I had done sibling pair matched DNA sequencing studies. This was a talk about a year or 2 ago. And we looked at individuals where one sibling was autistic and the other one was not. And we did an entire DNA sequencing of the CFTR gene. And what I found was that 100% of those with autism had minor mutations in the CFTR gene. So not the major genes that cause cystic fibrosis, but minor genes that affect ion transport were predisposing factors for autism that you did not see in the matched sibling pair. So again, another reason to look at methylation with respect to CFTR. And again, in the visual from the same article, those without issues are methylated properly, those with problems with CF undermethylated DNA. Arsenic detoxification is kind of a catch-22. You need methylation in order to detoxify arsenic. On the other hand, arsenic will impair the methylation cycle. And I had one woman out in California recently so sick for years with chronic fatigue. We ran a home water test, and I'll get to the importance of testing later on. And her well was loaded with arsenic. Essentially, the woman, even though she did not have a lot of mutations in the methylation cycle, her methylation cycle was poisoned because of arsenic in the water. Viruses that are retroviruses can in fact integrate into the genome, and this may be a factor with certain chronic viral infections, live virus vaccines, something to be thinking about. And so you need proper methylation in order for a virus in the system to be silenced. If you're not methylated properly, then you can't control these viruses in the body. And so it's another reason why looking at methylation status, making sure that young kids are properly methylated before vaccination might be a wise path to try to eliminate some problems later in life. And so again, looking at the way retroviruses, which are the type of viruses certain live virus vaccines are, or individuals who have problems with AIDS or DNA-based viruses, these viruses will integrate into the genome, and the only way to keep them quiet is with proper methylation. A recent article that shows that kind of the whole mind-body connection, and I'll digress a moment and say that this book that I just came out with is a very basic book. Someone was telling me that it's taken them a while to get through one of my other books, which is a little deeper. This basically explains methylation in layman's terms, and the last chapter is all about spirituality. And this kind of connects the mind-body connection in terms of spirituality, that positive informations and positive thought processes actually affect the genetic mechanisms. And And the reference for that article that came out about a month ago, tying together positive thought patterns with the effect on your DNA and methylation and epigenetics. Conversely, your experiences also leave a genetic mark on your epigenetics, and whether those experiences are positive ones or more negative ones, such as child abuse, that does also affect epigenetics. And so whether we're looking at environmental toxins, whether we're looking at CFTR, whether we're looking at infectious diseases, whether it's bacteria or viruses, or the experiences we have, it's critical for this pathway to be able to function properly in the body. And the beauty of the pathway that we're looking at is that you can use dietary components, nutritional supplements, to bypass these mutations. And so whether we're looking at cancer prevention and looking at nutritional supplements, or whether we look at the effect on the mom's diet, and this is an article that just came out last week, that what we eat nutritionally makes a difference in terms of our epigenetic mechanisms in our body, so that we have regulation to help to control all the other genes. And so the program that I utilize basically looks at genetics, epigenetics, the effect of the environment, as well as infectious agents. And you want to be looking at the whole picture, because any one of them by itself can unbalance the others. And the problem is that the pathway we look at affects the DNA sequence itself, as well as the epigenetic mechanism. And so if we look at this, we've been talking about epigenetics so far, but we can also look at specific mutations in the genes in this pathway and the consequences that they have. And so whether we're looking at the COMT gene and the role it may play in schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, or the slew of articles that are out there about the MTHFR gene and propensity for cancer, COMT and other issues with neuropsychiatric issues, or the role that nutritional support in this pathway can even play for cystic fibrosis, we want to be looking at the actual genes, the DNA, as well as these epigenetic mechanisms. A recent article that came out that mutations in these genes, some of them, actually play a role in terms of how sensitive individuals are to toxins like mercury. And so my goal would be the minute that every child was born, run a nutrigenomic test on it. Find out where the imbalances are and start to support them nutritionally from the time of birth, and actually before that when the mom is pregnant. Let's prevent some of the problems we're dealing with. I mean, the epidemic of autism, but also, I'll show figures in a moment, the epidemic of ADHD, the epidemic of Alzheimer's, chronic fatigue, it's across the board. And what's so unfortunate is that if we would just supplement nutritionally, we'd be able to bypass a number of these issues. And so the silver lining is that it's a nutritional pathway. The nutrients alone are going to make a difference. Trying to again show you that if you look on the left at one of my favorite poems, and let's assume that the E key on your computer is broken. So if the E key on your computer is broken, that's like having a structural mutation in a gene, let's say MTHFR. If methylation is functioning properly, then your computer will autocorrect, and you're still going to be able to read it. It doesn't matter that the E key is broken, because you can autocorrect. The problem is that the key that's broken in the pathway we look at removes the ability to autocorrect. And so over time, as more and more keys break on your computer without an autocorrect, it will reach a point where you can no longer read this document. And that's why everybody should be concerned about methylation. Looking at it again another way, these are structural mutations in the DNA. This is how DNA methylation can add roots to your DNA to help to regulate it. What we're looking at in the pathway that I will show you diagrams for in a moment is the combination of genetics and epigenetics that are now broken, and that basically leads to things like cancer. These references are all the different cancers that have been shown to be directly related to problems with methylation in the body. And it's not just about cancer. The range of health conditions that can ensue when we don't have proper methylation in the body basically cover everybody's practice in this room and then some. And that's why everyone needs to be thinking about this and looking at it. Part of the reason it's such an issue is methylation is central to so many critical pathways in the body. Everything from making new DNA and RNA for your cells, as well as immune function, digestive issues, neurotransmitter balance, and the list goes on. If we look at the increase in Alzheimer's disease, it basically parallels the same increase that we've seen, whether it's for autism or chronic fatigue. And so some of these chronic health issues aren't going away, they're getting worse. If we look at chronic fatigue, we've got the same pattern. We look at ADHD, we have the same pattern. We look at autism, we're looking at the same pattern. And actually, I've shown only the diagram for autism by state, but if you look state by state, if one of these health issues isn't a problem, it's another one. And so it's something we all need to be looking at. And so the bottom line is, regardless of where you live, these are certain issues you need to be considering. And if we can remove the genetic predisposing factors by nutritional support, then we lower the risk of a problem in all of these areas. Because as we've talked about before, this pathway we're looking at doesn't just affect genetics and epigenetics. It's your ability to address environmental toxins as well as infectious diseases. Now, a lot of the genetic tests out there on the market look at a little bit of something all over the place. And the analogies that I make in the field of nutrigenomics book are about looking at these pathways as highways and traffic circles in your body. And if I live in Maine and you're in California and you want to get from here to where I am, there's not enough information in between for me to be able to help you. There's too many gaps. That's why I believe in focusing in on a single pathway and looking at it comprehensively. Knowing what's going on, because one addition that you add impacts other genes. And so it's not a question of if your test measures 30 genes, such as the test I designed, or whether it measures 1,000. There's 25,000 genes in the body. And until we know what all of them do and how those pathways are interconnected and what those results mean, having more isn't always better. Before the talk, someone was talking to me about the GAD gene SNPs they were getting from the 23andMe test. And while I do feel GAD is critically important, we don't even know what those SNPs mean. We don't know, does it mean the gene is overactivated or underactivated? Does it silence it or is it a silent mutation? So if it's not well characterized and we can't do anything with it, more information doesn't gain us anything. What we want to be doing is look within that composite of information that you get and say, what can we usefully use from it? And again, that's why we put the knowyourgenetics.com site up for free, so that if you've run some other test with 5,000 genes, you can at least pull out the methylation genes and find out at no cost, what does it mean and how do we deal with it? The test that I utilize looks at this group of 30 genes, but again, even if you run another test, it doesn't matter, you can still get information about the program. There are two things to keep in mind when you do DNA testing, or actually three. One is, you'll run this test once for your whole life, or your patient will run it once. And so the data today is the same data that will mean something 10 years, 20 years, 30 years from now. And so it's not necessarily the best place to skimp on cost, because you're going to rely on that data and you want to make sure the data is accurate. The second is the type of sample. The cleanest sample is going to be a blood draw from your doctor, there's no question about it. because bacteria is going to contaminate the samples, and bacterial DNA will influence the results. And so a blood draw from a doctor is going to be the cleanest way to get a DNA test. Next best would probably be what we use for this test, which is a finger prick that someone can do at home, although I'd advise them to do it through the doctor if they can, because again, it will be a more sterile environment. Saliva testing is great, it's inexpensive, people are more compliant, you get the test out to a lot more people, but it's more likely that those samples are going to be contaminated by bacteria in your mouth. And especially the sulfide oxidase gene that I was talking to some individuals about before this talk, that is notorious for being contaminated, showing up from bacterial contamination. So you want to be looking at the type of sample, how clean it is, as well as the technology that the lab is utilizing to analyze the DNA. Regardless, I'd rather have somebody run a saliva test, even if it's not the most accurate, than do nothing at all. I truly believe in my heart everybody should be running these tests. And part of the reason I feel so strongly about that is look at the range of imbalances and disease states and chronic issues that can occur in the body if we don't have this cycle functioning properly. And so again, the beauty is that we can use nutrition to bypass some of the mutations in this pathway. And so if we start with two of the cycles, and I talk about them in the book like traffic circles that drive each other almost like gears, okay? And the point at which they intersect is where we would utilize B12. And I call this the shortcut through the cycle, and going around the long route is utilizing these enzymes. And my suggestion, if you all have the simplified protocol on a disc in your packets, is to start off with a shortcut because that is something that's most easily tolerated by anyone. And the way I like to support this shortcut is with phospholipids, phosphatidylserine mix and DHA. And that seems to be very well tolerated. And then what we also utilize is a general vitamin I design called All-in-One that has very low doses of everything you need to support the methylation cycle. There are some protocols that dive right in and use very high doses of 5-methyl-THF to bypass the NTHFR gene. But where the problem comes in, if you add very high doses, because you know you have a mutation here, but you don't know what's going on over here, you run the risk of depleting the system of nutrients that sit at this point. So this is a point in the cycle where we feed in with B12. And one of the relationships that I found over the years, and I've been talking about a lot, is lithium is very related to B12 levels. If you're adding high dose B12, and you haven't checked first to make sure lithium is in balance, you run the risk of depleting already low lithium levels. And that affects mood, it creates aggression issues, it affects behavior. And so, going back here again, if all you're looking at is an MTHFR mutation, and you're dealing with it by adding high doses of 5-methyl-THF, you run the risk of creating problems with low lithium that are going to cause issues with aggression in the body. And also, lithium tends to trap with potassium, and especially in individuals who might be on birth control where we're already worried about potassium levels, those potassium levels may drop further. Also, as I'll describe in a moment, certain CBS mutations that sit here, if you're adding high doses here and you can make it all the way through to here, you may be just losing everything that you've added via the transsulfuration pathway and creating high levels of ammonia. So you want to be looking at the whole cycle. You don't want to just be looking at isolated genes in the cycle. And so this is what I call the methylation cycle. We're used to seeing methionine with folate. What's different about this than what a number of other individuals look at is I've been able to tie together the need for tetrahydrobiopterin for helping to generate dopamine and serotonin, and then that naturally, because of the role of BH4, ties together the urea cycle. And so what you do here impacts everything here. And so we can look at where we can add supplementation to bypass mutations. And again, looking at the whole composite, not looking at single genes. And also, I always feel less is better. You can always add more. But the body is in a very delicate balance. All of these pathways are so interconnected. Using a little bit doesn't throw your system out of balance, and it gives you time to see if someone's going to react well or not. And so the starting point that I talk about in the simplified pathway is looking at adding DHA and phospholipid mix to get started with the shortcut. And then one of the next things we do is run a hair metal test to make sure lithium is in balance. If lithium is not in balance, get lithium in balance before you look at adding B12. And then look at adding only very low levels of 5-methyl-THL. The other place where people tend to add high doses is high-dose folinic to shut down the SHMT portion of the pathway. But again, unless you have a picture of what's going on across this entire pathway, you run the risk of throwing the system out of balance. When we talk about B12, and I had a question earlier about the different types of B12. And first of all, I'm not a fan, other than very low doses of it, of cyanocobalamin, because what you're basically doing is adding a cyanide molecule to the body. And the body needs to get rid of it. And the way the body gets rid of the cyanide group is by using up your hydroxy B12. What I find is almost any individual will be able to tolerate hydroxy B12, which can make methyl B12 in the body as needed. Those individuals who get jittery from coffee, who can't handle methyl donors, tend not to do well with methyl B12. If somebody can handle, like I'm one of those people, I can drink a cup of coffee at night and then go to bed. I can handle methyl B12. But the easiest route not to have someone start to detox or have adverse effects is just to be looking at low-dose hydroxy B12 and also low-dose adenosine B12. When we see imbalances on branched-chain amino acids on a urine amino acid test, when we see signs of ketosis on a MAP test, those are situations where you want to be looking at adenosine B12. Also, someone who's exercising a lot. One of my daughters is a professional dancer. She's someone who's dancing hours every day. I look at being sure she has adenosine B12. I'd always rather use hydroxy and adenosine B12 so someone can take SAMe as a supplement than give them methyl B12 if they're kind of on the fence of being able to tolerate it, and then have them not be able to handle SAMe. Again, another picture looking at the various forms of B12. If someone can handle methyl B12, go for it. If they can't, they seem to tolerate hydroxy B12 really well as adenosine B12. And another point you're looking at on that MAP test is MMA levels to see if we need adenosine B12. Symptoms of a lack of B12, they run the range from apathy to hallucinations. I had a woman years ago who had an obsessive compulsive hair pulling disorder, and she would pull out her eyebrows and her eyelashes whenever she was stressed. And all we had to do with her was just add more B12. But again, if you're adding B12, think about lithium. If you're thinking about lithium, think about potassium. Why you want to be thinking about what form of B12 you're using. A lot of supplements do have cyano B12 because it's stable and inexpensive. Low doses are fine, but if you're somebody who's using massive doses of B12, you want to really be thinking about the fact that you may be depleting hydroxy B12 stores in your body by getting high-dose cyanocobalamin. When we have a lack of B12, it can throw off your Krebs cycle. And so your results on that MAP test can look off, not just because oxalic acid is high, but actually due to a lack of B12. Lack of B12 can cause that Krebs cycle to go in reverse. And the references for that are this article and this article. And so what I would suggest is if you're seeing abnormal values of Krebs cycle intermediates, GCA intermediates on one of your tests, take a look at B12 levels, take a look at lithium levels. Articles supporting the fact that lithium helps to transport B12 in the body. And I don't know how familiar many of you are with Dr. Richard Keith, but he and I have been talking about this for a few years now, and I'm hoping that he's going to do some basic science research to get to the bottom of this. His area of expertise is one of the enzymes in that pathway. And what I find is that people with certain types of MTR mutations are going through B12 much faster and going through lithium much faster. Another article supporting the fact that lithium helps to transport B12, and yet another article for you on that topic. I mentioned CBS issues before, so we look at the methylation cycle, and certain types of CBS mutations or upregulations, meaning that that gene is overactive. And what can happen is you're draining your methylation cycle intermediates, and you end up with very high levels of taurine instead of nice levels of glutathione that you like. Several years ago, before he passed, Dr. Rich, working with Dr. Nathan, looked at individuals with chronic fatigue syndrome, and he found that as this got in better balance, the level of natural glutathione increased. Also talking about the tetrahydrobiopterin portion of the cycle, BH4. If we have certain mutations in MTHFR, that seems to be impairing the level of BH4. Aluminum, which is present in so many vaccines and environmental toxins, seems to complicate that. If we have less BH4 and more BH2, we're not doing a good job of making serotonin and dopamine. And as we work our way through the urea cycle, we're making oxygen-free radicals instead of processing them properly. And so again, if we look at this whole cycle, it's all interconnected. BH4 I was just talking about is right here, tied together with the urea cycle, and if we don't have sufficient BH4, we're going to end up with reactive oxygen species. If we don't have this portion of the pathway in balance, we can't generate methyl groups for the epigenetics that we talked about earlier. And if we've got imbalances here, everything can be draining out through taurine, which is why you want to be looking at a urine amino acid test for that. We can layer on top of the cycle where all of the genes sit. The next step is to look at the cofactors that we want to be paying attention to that help those genes to function. We can look at where we can add in nutritional support to bypass those mutations, and again, I would suggest looking at the simplified protocol to start, but basically you want to look at supporting the shortcut with phospholipids and DHA and the all-in-one vitamin or something equivalent, and then slowly add in support to bypass the rest of the mutations once you're certain lithium and potassium are in balance. We can look at and layer on where toxic environmental toxins inhibit in the pathway, and finally where the mutations sit that imbalance this pathway. And what I'm suggesting is if we just can focus in on this pathway, if we can just look at supporting to bypass these mutations, we have a way to address so many of those health issues that I mentioned earlier. And the body is then able to generate the methyl groups we need for epigenetic regulation of all the other genes we're not even looking at. Another diagrammatic representation of this pathway, and what this shows you is that once we get to the urea cycle, now we're tied together with that Krebs cycle. And as I mentioned earlier, changes here in terms of lack of B12 impact over here in terms of that Krebs cycle functioning properly. And by virtue of arginine, we're tied together with creatinine, so this is like one big circle, it's like a globe. It's also interconnected. And nature is a beautiful thing. I love the fact that this is a nutritional pathway, that if it's not working, it really is not synonymous with life. Whether we're talking about miscarriages, whether we're talking about neural tube defects, whether we're talking about Alzheimer's or heart disease or cancer, And it's all sitting right there for us to be able to address no matter what your practice is. And so the second big piece, besides looking at genetic testing, is a heavy emphasis on biochemical testing. Again, I'm from a research background, and so I want data for everything. I don't want to just say to you that adding shortcut support makes a difference. I want you to run a test and prove that it does. I don't just want to say to you, you need lithium for B12 transport. I want you to notice that when your lithium is too low on a hair metal test, you're not going to see any cobalt on a urine test. And if you're adding B12 without paying attention to lithium, you're probably seeing very high blood B12 levels because that B12 isn't getting transported. And so we can start out with the genetic pathway. But then we can look at other types of testing. And the tests don't have to be DDI tests. And had I realized Genova's here today, I would have thrown in more Genova tests. These are just easy ones to download. The point is tests, okay? I don't look at, and one of the things I'm going to be doing this July is going through every test and put down what the test is, what the result is, and then what my suggestion would be and my logic, which is very different sometimes from the logic you get from the test company. And that's something we're expecting to have online at no charge with a free test system like we do with genetics. So no matter whose test you've run, you can input your data and get my suggestions as another way to try to help you to be able to be doing this. Because honestly, I handwrite on tests 7 days a week without a break. And I need more help. I need more of you to be doing this program, understanding it, embracing it, and running it through your offices, because I'm only one person. The value of a test like this is it gives you methylation cycle intermediates in the blood, and what we tend to see is people who have AHC1 mutations tend to be very, very low in SAMe, and that's one of the reasons why, as kind of an ace in the hole, I want to know you have the ability to add SAMe if you need, which is why I like to rely more on hydroxy and adenosine B12 initially, until I know if somebody needs SAMe. Let it finish up. Here we go. My point here is, even the color of the urine. All of the urine tests are displayed as a function of creatinine levels. And so what you have to think about is, if the urine is very dilute, you're dividing all the values by a very small number. If the creatinine number is very high, you're dividing all of those values by a huge number. And so one of the things I would caution is when you look at a urine toxic and essential element test, something that might not look very significant may actually be significant if the creatinine level was high. And so I would consider this a low creatinine number. And so even though this excretion looks significant, maybe it's not, because our creatinine is only 28. If it was sitting around 100, 150, which tends to be more average on these tests, these values might not look as impressive. One of the reasons I like urine toxin and essential element is to be able to look at cobalt levels to make sure that we're seeing an impact of added B12 in the body. If you don't see anything here, or if you're seeing either very low or very high levels of lithium, the first thing you want to do is run a hair metal test for lithium. Fecal metal tests. Someone was asking me earlier, how do you tell the difference between someone not reacting well and detox? If you think there's detox, run toxic metal tests, run a urine test, run a fecal test, run a hair test. Again, I come from a very data-intensive background. If you're not sure, run a non-invasive test and let's get the data and see what's going on. Hair metal tests, I think, are critical. They would probably be the first starting point. And the reason is, the first thing I want to do is I want to look at lithium levels. If lithium levels are low, that's the first thing you want to be addressing before you even go anywhere near adding any specialized forms of folate for that long read around the cycle. Iodine tests, iodine seems to have an antagonistic effect with the lithium levels in the body. And so I'm not adverse to adding iodine, but again, look and see if you actually need to be adding it. Because if you're adding it and you don't need to be, you again run the risk of maybe negatively impacting lithium levels. Comprehensive drinking water analysis, if you're seeing a lot of excretion of metals on your fecal metal, your urine, your hair, that seem to be consistently the same metals, look at running a water test to make sure that that's not a continuing source of exposure. The other is if you have someone whose genetics don't look too bad, but they're still really sick, like my woman with the arsenic poisoning, go ahead and run a water test. I had another individual where the hair metal test manganese was really high. Too much manganese will make you do good. Ran a water test and the filter on their system, it was a permanganate filter, wasn't working, and the amount of manganese in the water system was poisoning this body. Porphyrin test I use not as much, mostly as a backup to say what's going on with toxic metals in the system. Looking at some sort of urine amino acid test, and again, Genova has urine amino acid tests too. But one of the big things you want to be looking at is high taurine levels. On this sample that I got off the website, look at how high taurine is. I look at that and I say CVS mutation problems. The analogy I give is you don't know you have a CVS issue until you're already adding methylation support. It's like having a leaky bathtub. You don't know the bathtub's leaking until you filled it up with water. Until you fill your methylation cycle up with water, okay? Until you fill that bathtub with methylation cycle intermediates, you don't know that the plug is leaking and that everything is draining down. And it's not just about high taurine. The next step in the pathway is your ability to process sulfur groups. And so when you're seeing this, you're overwhelming your sulfite oxidase. And that sulfite oxidase needs molybdenum and B12 to function. And so any B12 we got is getting used up trying to process what's happening downstream from this point. And if you realize that I have never seen a true serious homozygous mutation in that sulfite oxidase in terms of impaired function, it gives you a sense of how critical that enzyme is in the body. And how many adults that you see, especially with chronic fatigue, that have sulfur issues or sulfite sensitive. And so if you're seeing high taurine, this is something you want to be addressing. Also, when you see it, it means your body isn't making glutathione the way it needs to. Work out of Cornell showed that cysteine levels sit at a juncture. It's almost like a fork in the road. And when the levels of cysteine are very high, you're going to go to taurine. If the levels of cysteine are more moderate, you're going to make glutathione. And so what we want is to achieve balance in the body. The other kinds of things you want to be looking at are to look at the branched chain amino acids. If your branched chain amino acids aren't being processed properly, you want to be thinking about using some adenosine B12 and also be concerned about maple syrup smells in the urine. Looking at, we have a genetic test on here. Looking at BH4 levels, and in this case, even though the relative level of BH4 looks okay, the level of neopterin is also high, which says to me that the immune system may be overstimulated. When I see this, it says to me I want to be running gut tests to see what gut bugs are going on, and probably look at supporting with either the supplement we call the A1298C supplement, or there's a lovely homeopathic BH4 supplement you can use now to help to support BH4 levels. I really love the map test. Someone asked me earlier about imbalances in neurotransmitters. Go right here and take a look at the breakdown products. If you're seeing really high breakdown products from your neurotransmitters, then that's a piece of the puzzle you want to be looking at. The other thing you want to be looking at is seeing from this standpoint, do we need to be adding some adenosine B12? Do we need to be adding carnitine? In this case, the ketosis markers aren't looking bad, but sometimes we see those values sky high. Also, when I tend to see high levels here, indicators of bacterial issues, but also indicators that we may need additional BH4. The energy markers sitting here, if they're all over the place, if you're having imbalances, think again about B12 levels, because those references I showed you earlier, imbalances here are related to imbalances in B12 levels, and if you're thinking B12, think lithium and potassium. I actually always run 2 stool tests at the same time. I find that the composite of them gives you more information than either one alone. And because you basically can get people to run a test like this once or twice a year, the time to do it is get both sets of information at the same time. So I always run the DDI test as well as the Genova test at the same time. While we have a Genova person here, I want to say I'm very unhappy we discontinued the DNA-based test for Helicobacter, and I look forward to having you get it back in. Because it's a real issue, and where Helicobacter can hide in the cells in the body, even though an antigen test is good, this isn't a for sure rule out that you don't have a problem in the body. There are times where you will get a negative antigen test and you'll get a positive DNA test. And so I really look forward to getting a DNA-based Helicobacter test again soon. Tests for individuals with chronic fatigue, oftentimes they're going and have imbalances not just in gut bugs, and also looking at what's going on with bone, especially when we've got problems with the MTR gene, because we tend to see significant imbalances in boron levels when individuals have MTR mutations. Again, just looking at the whole body, making sure that the liver can process all the toxins that we're dealing with and supporting all the organ systems. So we're looking for and looking at DNA damage, tying the whole conversation back again to the fact that we've got this nutritional pathway in the body. There are defined places where there's mutations in this pathway. We know how to supplement to bypass. Doing it in a measured manner, more doesn't mean better. Doing it in a systematic manner so that we don't trigger detox in a way that you have patient noncompliance. And then doing a lot of follow-up biochemical testing so that you're getting data and feedback so you're doing it correctly so you can keep someone on the program. And so the sins of the grandfathers, it turns out that, well, it makes logical sense that the mother's epigenetics would be transferred to the fetus. But it turns out it's also the father's, that the environment of that sperm, and it's not just the dad, but it's also